Humanity stayed silent for centuries, then one message shook the entire galaxy. The first thing I heard that morning was a dying civilization. Not metaphorically. Not as some poetic way of describing a bad shift. I mean, I sat down at my desk with a cold cup of coffee, pressed my headset into place, and listened to a species beg for its life in a language I had spent 11 years learning to understand. My name is Arjun Mehta. I am 51 years old. I have worked for the Bureau of Xenolinguistic Monitoring for 34 years, which means I have spent more than half my life in a basement 3 levels below the surface of a building that does not appear on any public map in New Delhi. The Bureau does not advertise itself. It does not hold press conferences. As far as the rest of Earth is concerned, it does not exist. What we do, in the simplest possible terms, is listen. We have been listening for 312 years. It started with a faint signal in 2091, picked up by a radio telescope array in the Chilean Andes. The scientists who found it spent 6 months convincing themselves it was not natural. Then they spent another year convincing themselves it was not a mistake. Then they handed it to the government, and the government handed it to a small group of linguists and mathematicians who were quietly moved into a facility that no longer appears in any building registry, and the Bureau was born. The signal was not a greeting. It was not a welcome mat left out for a young species stumbling into the cosmos for the first time. It was a commercial shipping manifest from a species called the Vorith, addressed to another species called the Palendi, detailing the transfer of 60,000 units of refined mineral ore across a distance of 14 light years. We were not contacted. We were overheard. And that distinction, that single quiet fact, shaped everything that followed. The Bureau's founders understood something that most people, if they ever learned what we knew, would have found difficult to accept. The galaxy was not silent. The galaxy was enormously, relentlessly loud. There were dozens of civilizations out there, broadcasting to each other across the stars, arguing and negotiating and celebrating and mourning and doing every messy, complicated thing that conscious beings do when they share a universe. They had been doing it for thousands of years. They had councils and alliances and trade routes and legal systems and historical grudges stretching back longer than human civilization had existed. And not one of them had ever noticed us. At first, that felt like a wound. I remember reading the early Bureau diaries, the ones written by the founders in those first bewildered years, and feeling the sting of it even across 3 centuries. They had looked up at the sky their entire lives believing that if anyone was out there, they would reach out. Instead, what they found was a crowded room that had simply never looked toward the corner where Earth was standing. But then, slowly, the Bureau learned something else. The galactic community was not kind to the civilizations it noticed. In 2134, we decoded a series of transmissions that described a diplomatic crisis between 2 mid-level powers over the colonization of a disputed star system. The smaller civilization lost the argument, then lost its colony, and then, 6 years later, lost the better part of its home fleet in what the dominant power described in its own transmissions as a peacekeeping operation. The transmissions after that grew fewer. Then they stopped. In 2178, we watched a species called the Denhari be absorbed into the Keth dominion through a process that the Keth called voluntary integration and that we, after translating every related document we could intercept, called something else entirely. The Keth dominion was the largest single power structure we had identified. They occupied a region of space spanning roughly 40 star systems, and they had been expanding steadily for at least 200 years. They did not conquer with fleets alone, though their fleets were enormous. They conquered with paperwork and pressure and patience, surrounding smaller civilizations with trade agreements that slowly tightened into dependency, until the moment came when those civilizations had no other options left. In 2187, Earth held what was internally called the Great Deliberation. It was not a public event. No elected official addressed a camera. No journalist filed a report. The Bureau's senior analysts, 17 people in a room with no windows, presented everything they had learned to a council of representatives from every major government on Earth. They laid out the full picture, the galactic community, its powers, its dangers, its patterns, and humanity's current position in all of it. The debate lasted 9 days. I was not there. I was 6 years old in 2187. But I have read the transcripts. I have read them many times, because they explain everything that came after, and they explain something about what we are as a species that I find difficult to put into words but impossible to forget. The argument for speaking was simple. We are here. We should say so. Hiding implies fear, and fear invites contempt. The argument for silence was longer, and it won. We did not know enough yet. We had been listening for less than a century, and the civilizations out there had been operating for thousands of years. We did not know the full shape of what we were dealing with. And in the absence of that knowledge, announcing ourselves would be handing every player in a game we did not yet understand a piece of information they could use against us before we even knew the rules. So we said nothing. And we kept listening. By the time I joined the Bureau in 2009 at the age of 17 as a junior translation assistant, we had 312 years of intercepted transmissions. We had files on 61 distinct civilizations. We knew their languages, their histories, their internal politics, their military structures, their psychological tendencies, their greatest fears, and their most embarrassing secrets. We knew them the way a person knows a book they have read 100 times, from the margins to the index. My specific assignment was the Vareth Cluster, a collection of 7 inhabited systems in the mid-galactic range whose primary civilization, the Vareth, were among the most peaceful we had encountered. They were small. They were not technologically advanced by galactic standards. They were not wealthy. What they were was old in the way that a culture can be old, with an art tradition stretching back 40,000 years and a social philosophy built around the idea that a civilization's worth is measured not by what it takes but by what it creates. I had been listening to the Vareth for 11 years. I knew their music. I knew their seasonal festivals. I knew the name of their most celebrated poet and the name of the river where he was born. I knew them the way you know the people who live next door, except I had never said hello, and they had no idea I existed. That was the part one had always told myself was fine. I was starting to have trouble believing that. The coffee on my desk had gone cold. The signal in my headset was still playing. Outside the Bureau's basement, the sun was rising over New Delhi. Up on the surface, people were beginning their day, buying breakfast from street vendors, arguing with taxi drivers, living their lives in comfortable ignorance of the fact that 70 meters below their feet, a man named Arjun Mehta was listening to an alien civilization plead for help in a language no human was supposed to know. I set down my cup. I turned up the volume. And I listened. That was the morning of March the 4th, 2401. It was the last morning that anything about my life felt ordinary. The signal that came in at 0347 was not the first distress call I had ever heard. In 34 years with the Bureau, I had processed more than I could count. Most of them were old by the time they reached my desk, years or decades out of date, the events they described already resolved or already forgotten. Distance does that to urgency. Light takes time, and so do radio waves, and so does grief. But this one was different. This one was live. I knew that immediately from the subcarrier frequency, a narrowband emergency channel the Vareth used only in the most severe circumstances. I had seen it activated 3 times in 11 years, twice for natural disasters and once for a brief internal conflict that resolved itself within a month. I had flagged all 3 events, filed my reports, and moved on. This time, I flagged it and could not move on. The voice in the transmission belonged to a Vareth called Sovereign. I recognized him because I had been listening to Vareth Council broadcasts for years, and Sovereign was the Minister of Interstellar Communication, which among the Vareth was a quiet administrative role focused mostly on maintaining contact between their 7 inhabited systems. He was not a military man. He was not a crisis leader. He was a civil servant with a careful voice who had once given a 20-minute speech about the importance of accurate record-keeping in long-distance trade agreements. He was now speaking in a tone I had never heard from him before. The translation came automatically through my system, refined over years of calibration to the specific dialect of the Vareth capital, and I read the words on my screen as he spoke them. This is Sovereign, Minister of Interstellar Communication for the Vareth peoples, transmitting on Emergency Channel 9 from the Council Chamber of Veth Prime. We are under direct assault. The Keth Dominion has entered our primary system without declaration and without warning. Our orbital platforms have been disabled. We have received no formal communication, no ultimatum, no demand. There is nothing to negotiate. They are not here to negotiate. I sat very still. He continued. I am transmitting this to all open galactic frequencies in the hope that someone will hear it. The Vareth are not a military power. We have no capacity to resist what is happening. I am asking anyone who can act to please act. I am asking anyone who can speak to please speak. I am asking anyone who is listening to not look away. And then, after a pause so brief it might have been a breath or might have been a decision, he said one more thing. We know that we are small. We know that intervening on our behalf carries risk. We are not asking anyone to save us from foolishness or bad luck. We are asking someone to witness what is being done to us, and to say that it was wrong. That is all we are asking. That someone say it was wrong. The transmission ended. I pulled up my secondary monitor and began cross-referencing the Keth movement data we had been tracking for the past 8 months. The Keth had been repositioning their border fleets slowly, the kind of slow that is designed to look like routine patrol rotation to anyone who is not paying very close attention. We had been paying very close attention. I had filed 3 reports over the past 6 months noting the pattern and flagging the Varith cluster as a potential point of pressure. The reports had been received, acknowledged, and filed. Nothing had been done because there was nothing for us to do. We did not speak. We did not act. We watched. I pulled up the Keth movement data now and felt something drop in my chest. They had not sent a patrol fleet to Veth Prime. They had sent their 3rd expansion force, 47 vessels of various classes, the same formation they had used in the Denhari integration of 2178 and the Palendi border action of 2213. I knew this formation. I had written a 600-page analysis of it 8 years ago that sat in our internal archive under the category of historical documentation. I opened a second channel and called my direct supervisor, a methodical man named George Calloway who had been with the Bureau for 22 years and who valued process above nearly everything else. He answered on the 3rd ring. Meta. It's early. Sir, I need you to look at the Varith cluster feed right now. A pause. I heard him moving. Then quiet as he read. I see it, he said. I've cross-referenced the Keth formation. It matches the Denhari and Palendi operations exactly. I know what it matches. Then you know what they're going to do. Another pause, longer this time. File a report, Arjun. Flag it as priority 1. I'll make sure it gets to the director by noon. And then what? And then the director will review it and determine the appropriate course of action within the framework of the silence protocol. I stared at my screen. Sova Ren's voice was still in my head. We are asking someone to witness what is being done to us. George, I said. They're going to finish this in days. A priority 1 report reviewed by noon means a response by when, exactly? Next week. The week after. The protocol exists for a reason. The protocol was written by people who never had to listen to a minister of a peaceful civilization broadcasting on an emergency frequency because no one else was going to help them. Calloway was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had the careful, even tone of someone choosing words the way a person chooses steps across ice. I understand that this is difficult. It is difficult for me too. But you know what our mandate is. You have known it since your first day here. I know exactly what our mandate is. Then file the report. He ended the call. I filed the report. I labeled it priority 1. I included every piece of supporting data I had, the formation analysis, the movement timeline, the historical parallels, the projected duration of the operation. I sent it upward through the proper channels at 0419. Then I sat back in my chair and thought about Sova Ren's last words for a very long time. I thought about the Denhari, whose transmissions had gone quiet. I thought about the 7 other civilizations I had found in the archive that showed the same pattern, the same slow repositioning, the same sudden assault, the same silence afterward. 7 of them, over 200 years, and each time the galactic community had received the news through secondary reports filed weeks after the fact, expressed what could generously be called concern, and moved on. I thought about the Great Deliberation of 2187 and the argument that had won. We do not know enough yet. We need to understand the game before we announce ourselves. We had been listening for 312 years. I knew every move the Keth had ever made. I knew their command structure, their internal communications, their strategic doctrine, their weaknesses, and their fears. I had more reliable intelligence on the Keth Dominion than the Keth Dominion had on itself, because they lied to each other constantly and we had no reason to lie. I opened a new file on my secondary terminal. Not a report. Not a flag. Something else entirely. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had expected fear, or hesitation, or the sensation of standing at the edge of something very high. Instead, I felt something quieter and more certain than I had felt in a long time. I felt clear. I began to type. I was not thinking about the protocol. I was thinking about Sova Ren's voice on a dying channel, asking not for rescue, not for miracles, but simply for someone to say that what was happening was wrong. 312 years of silence. I had always been proud of the patience that implied. I was no longer sure that patience was the right word for it. I typed for 40 minutes without stopping. When I was done, I read it back once. I made 3 small corrections. And then, before I could talk myself out of it, I routed it through our deep space relay network and sent it to every open galactic frequency we had ever identified. All 63 of them. The time was 0507. George Calloway would not see what I had done until 0830 at the earliest. By then, traveling at the speed of light, my message would already be 43 million kilometers from Earth and accelerating toward the stars. I leaned back in my chair. I looked at the ceiling of the basement, the plain gray ceiling of a building that did not appear on any public map. I thought about everything that was going to happen next. I thought about Sova Ren. I thought about the Denhari, and the Palendi, and the 7 civilizations in the archive whose names I knew and whose silences I had documented. I thought about the first human word spoken to the galaxy in 312 years. Then I got up, walked to the small break room at the end of the hall, and made myself a fresh cup of coffee. If I was going to face whatever was coming, I was not going to do it with a cold cup. The message was 47 words long. I know people expect more. 3 centuries of silence, and humanity's first word to the galaxy turns out to be the length of a paragraph. No grand declaration, no philosophical treatise, no poetry. 47 words, plain and clean and precise, in every major galactic language simultaneously, translated with an accuracy that would later be described by 3 separate xenolinguistic scholars as technically impossible for a species of our assumed standing. That last part was intentional. The first section of the message was a name. Ours. Not Earth, which meant nothing to anyone out there, but a designation drawn from the oldest root of our most widely spoken languages, rendered into Galactic Standard with a care that made it clear we had been studying Galactic Standard for a very long time. The second section was coordinates. Not ours. The Keth's. Specifically, the coordinates of every Keth military installation we had mapped over 2 centuries of careful monitoring. 41 installations, cross-referenced with Keth internal designations so there could be no confusion about what we were describing or how we had obtained the information. The third section was a single statement. 11 words. What is being done to the Verith people is wrong. We name it. And that was all. No threat. No demand. No ultimatum. No flourish of language or gesture toward power. Just the truth, stated clearly, by a species no one knew existed, with a precision that made it immediately obvious to every civilization that received it that the species in question had not announced itself from ignorance or accident. It had announced itself on purpose, at the moment of its choosing, with the confidence of someone who has been waiting for exactly the right hand to play. I was in the break room when my personal alert went off. Then it went off again. Then it went off 12 more times in 4 seconds, which had never happened before in my entire career, and I walked back to my desk at a pace that I will generously describe as controlled and sat down to find my screens filled with incoming intercepts from 17 different monitoring stations simultaneously. The galaxy had heard us. The first responses came from the Palendi High Council, who received the signal approximately 90 seconds after transmission began due to their position along our relay corridor. Their internal communications went from routine morning administrative traffic to what my translation system flagged as high agitation emergency session in under 4 minutes. Their council chair, a figure we had been monitoring for years, reportedly said, in the original Palendi, something that translated roughly as, "How long have they been out there?" The answer, had anyone asked me directly, was 312 years. But nobody was asking me anything yet. The Keth Dominion received the signal at roughly the same time, given the geometry of their fleet's current position. What happened inside their command structure in the following 30 minutes is something I would spend weeks reconstructing from intercepted communications, and what I found, once I had pieced it together, was not the reaction of a powerful empire that had been caught. It was the reaction of a powerful empire that suddenly could not find the walls. They knew their installations had been named. They knew the coordinates were accurate because they were the ones who had built those installations, and they recognized their own internal designations in a transmission from an unknown species broadcasting on every galactic frequency. They knew, with absolute certainty, that whoever had sent this message had been watching them for a very long time. What they did not know, and what was clearly destroying the coherence of their command structure in real time, was how long. And how much. The assault on Veth Prime paused at 0619, approximately 72 minutes after my transmission. Not a retreat. Not a withdrawal. A pause. The Keth fleet held position in high orbit, and for 6 hours, nothing moved and nothing fired. I watched the Verith emergency channels during those 6 hours and heard something shift in Sovereign's voice that I had not heard before. Not relief. Not yet. Something more fragile than that. Something that sounded like a person who has been bracing for impact and is no longer sure whether to relax or brace harder. On Earth, the situation was considerably less calm. George Calloway discovered what I had done at 0831, approximately 4 minutes after he arrived at his desk and began reviewing overnight activity logs. His call to me lasted approximately 90 seconds and consisted primarily of him stating my full name in a tone I had never heard from another human being, and then informing me that I was to remain at my station and not touch anything until the director arrived. The director, a composed and precise woman named Eleanor Ford who had led the bureau for 9 years, arrived at 0907. She did not raise her voice. She sat across from me in the small meeting room adjacent to my station, placed both hands flat on the table, and looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "Walk me through exactly what you sent and exactly why you sent it," she said. I did. I was thorough. I included the formation analysis, the historical parallels, the sovereign transmission, the 7 archived cases, my assessment of the protocol's response timeline relative to the projected duration of the Keth operation. I did not apologize. I explained. Eleanor Ford listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You understand that you have ended 3 centuries of policy with a 47-word message that you sent without authorization at 5 in the morning. "Yes," I said. "You understand that we cannot take it back." "Yes." "And you understand that everything we have built here, every protocol, every procedure, every careful structure of observation and patience, now has to be completely reconsidered." I understood that when I sent it. She looked at me for another long moment. Then she said something I had not expected. "What did the Verith minister say?" "The one on the emergency channel." I told her. I gave her the exact words. She asked me to repeat the last part. I did. "We are asking someone to witness what is being done to us, and to say that it was wrong. That is all we are asking." Eleanor Ford sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up. "You are confined to this building pending a full review," she said. "You will not make any further transmissions. You will not contact anyone outside the Bureau. You will make yourself available for full debriefing beginning this afternoon." Understood. She walked to the door. Then she stopped, with her hand on the frame, and spoke without turning around. "The Keth fleet," she said. It paused. "Yes." At 0619. A pause. "Good," she said. And left. By noon, 6 galactic civilizations were transmitting responses directly to the frequency coordinates embedded in my original message, asking in varying degrees of urgency and bewilderment who we were, how we knew what we knew, and what we intended. By 3 in the afternoon, the Keth Dominion's Supreme Coordinator had issued an internal communication to all fleet commanders that my monitoring station flagged automatically, and which I read in my office while George Calloway stood in the doorway watching me with an expression I could not quite categorize. The communication told the fleet commanders not to engage with any unknown vessels. It did not specify what counted as unknown. It did not address the transmission directly. It was the communication of a command structure that did not yet know how to frame what had happened, and that careful blankness told me more than a panicked response would have. They were afraid. Not of what we had said. Of what we knew. And they did not know the half of it yet. Somewhere above me, 3 levels up and then another 300 kilometers above that, a diplomatic vessel that had been maintained in quiet readiness for 11 years was cleared for launch at 1748 Earth Standard Time. Its crew had been selected, trained, and briefed over the course of a decade. They spoke 12 galactic languages between them. They had studied the political, cultural, and historical profiles of every major civilization in the galactic community with a thoroughness that no one on the receiving end of their first conversations would fully believe until they experienced it firsthand. They had been ready for a long time. The silence was over. And we had made sure that when we spoke, we had something worth saying. I read the Keth commander's message twice. Then I set it aside and opened a new monitoring file, pulling in the fresh incoming streams from all 63 frequencies simultaneously. Everyone was talking at once. For the first time in 3 centuries, I had something to say back. They did not expect what walked through the door. I do not mean that as an insult toward anyone who arrived that day. I mean it as a precise description of what happened when 6 separate diplomatic delegations, each from a civilization with decades or centuries of assumptions about the species that had sent that 47-word message, encountered actual human beings for the first time. They expected primitives. Or they expected chaos. Or they expected something young and rough and still figuring out how the universe worked. What they found was something they did not have a prepared framework for. I was there for all of it. I was also, technically, still under confinement to the Bureau facility, which made my presence in the meeting chamber slightly complicated from a procedural standpoint, but Eleanor Ford had signed my temporary clearance herself at 0600 that morning without comment, which I took as a sign that she had decided my usefulness outweighed whatever consequences I was still facing. The meeting chamber was not grand. It was a repurposed conference room in a government building in New Delhi that had been cleared and modified overnight. The walls were plain. The furniture was functional. The Earth representatives, 5 of them including a linguist, a historian, a senior diplomat named Charlotte Rice, and 2 technical specialists whose exact roles were never formally announced, sat on one side of a long table. On the other side sat delegates representing the Palendi Council, the Vorath Trade Federation, the smaller but influential Sivith Assembly, and 3 other civilizations I will call the Arendi, the Gal, and the distant Tauran Confederacy, each of which had sent a single authorized representative, each of whom had traveled at considerable speed and considerable risk to be present, because none of them had been willing to send only a communication when the alternative was coming in person to see for themselves. The Keth Dominion had not been invited. That was intentional. We would get to them, but not here, and not like this. The moment the session formally opened, the Sivith representative, a figure my files identified as a senior council voice of significant standing, spoke first. This was considered a breach of diplomatic protocol by at least 2 of the other delegations present, but nobody stopped it because everyone in the room wanted to hear what he was going to say. What he said, in galactic standard, was this. How long? Charlotte Rice, who had been briefed on this exact moment and had rehearsed her answer in 6 languages, looked at him calmly and said, 312 years. The silence that followed that statement was one of the most interesting silences I have ever observed, and I have spent my career in the business of silence. The Palendi delegate set down the item she had been holding. The Vorath representative, a young official who had been briefed on this meeting with less than 48 hours of preparation, made a sound that my translation system rendered as involuntary and then quickly controlled. The Gal representative, a creature whose species communicated through a combination of vocalization and precise physical positioning, shifted into a configuration my 11-year-old analysis notes described as deep reassessment. 312 years, the Sivith representative said again, not as a question. Yes, Charlotte Rice said. And in that time you never announced yourselves? No. Why? This was the question we had prepared for more than any other. It was also the question with the truest answer, which is sometimes the most difficult kind. Charlotte Rice said, we wanted to understand what we were entering before we entered it. The Palendi delegate spoke for the first time. And do you understand it? Better than most, Charlotte Rice said. And because that answer was technically an understatement of significant proportions, she added, we would be glad to demonstrate. What followed over the next 3 hours was the most carefully constructed diplomatic conversation in human history, and I was sitting 6 meters away from it with a wireless earpiece translating in real time and a small tablet in my lap into which I occasionally typed notes for the bureau record. The demonstration of our knowledge was measured. We did not flood the room with everything we had, because flooding a room with 3 centuries of intelligence is not a demonstration of capability, it is an act of aggression dressed in information. Instead, Charlotte Rice and her team produced, at precise moments in the conversation, specific pieces of data that answered questions before they were fully asked, corrected misunderstandings the moment they appeared, and twice addressed diplomatic sensitivities that the delegations present had not disclosed and did not know we were aware of. The effect was quiet and total. By the end of the first hour, the nature of the conversation had shifted in a way that was very hard to describe but very easy to feel. The delegations had arrived expecting to evaluate humanity, to determine our status, our threat level, our potential usefulness or danger. Somewhere in the second hour, without any formal announcement or change in procedure, they stopped evaluating us and started talking to us. Not as a curiosity. Not as a new arrival to be assessed. As a party that was present, informed, and capable of contributing to the room. It was, in its way, the quietest revolution I have ever witnessed. The Keth question came up mid-afternoon, raised by the Vorith representative, who was the most personally invested in it and who had been waiting with visible restraint for the right moment. The Verith cluster, he said. The Keth fleet has not moved in 4 days. What is happening there? Charlotte Rice looked at me. I gave a small nod. She had asked permission in advance to use my analysis in this section, and I had given it. The Keth fleet paused when our message was transmitted, she said. It has not resumed its operation because the Keth command structure is currently in internal crisis. The message we sent named their installations, which they know are accurate. They do not know how much else we know. And the uncertainty is, at this moment, functioning as a deterrent more effectively than any military response could. The Civith representative leaned forward. How much do you know? Charlotte Rice folded her hands on the table. We have monitored Keth internal communications for over 180 years. We have a complete record of every operation they have conducted in that period, including 7 instances of civilizational absorption that were never formally reported to the Galactic Assembly. The room was very quiet. 7, the Palendi delegate said. 7. We have the communications, the operational orders, the internal assessments, and the outcome reports for each one. Cross-referenced, authenticated, and organized by date. The GAL representative shifted again, this time into a configuration I had never seen before and could not immediately categorize. The Denhari, the Vorith representative said softly. Yes, Charlotte Rice said. Among others. What happened next was not planned, exactly, though we had anticipated something like it. The Palendi delegate asked to see the documentation. Charlotte Rice produced it, not the full archive, but a carefully selected sample, enough to establish pattern and enough to establish credibility. The sample was passed around the table. The delegations reviewed it in silence. Then the Vorith representative looked up and said something that no one at the table had quite expected. If you have had this information for 200 years, he said, why did you not act sooner? It was a fair question. It deserved a true answer. Because, Charlotte Rice said, we were not certain that acting sooner would result in anything except our own absorption. And a silent witness can document things that a visible one cannot. We chose to remain visible to no one and invisible to the record of everything. The Vorith representative was quiet for a moment. And now? Now, Charlotte Rice said, we are visible. And the record is complete. And we believe it is time to use it. By the end of the session, 3 of the 6 delegations had formally requested the full archive. Charlotte Rice told them she would need to consult with Earth's governing council before making any distribution decisions. That was true. It was also a careful way of establishing, without stating it directly, that the archive was ours, that we controlled it, and that access to it was a matter of negotiation, not assumption. As the delegations were preparing to leave, the Keth Dominion's official representative arrived. He had not been invited. He had come anyway, which told me something about how seriously the Keth were taking the situation, and also about how much they had misjudged it. He was a senior diplomatic officer, a smooth and experienced figure who had spent decades representing the Dominion in difficult conversations and who carried with him the practiced ease of someone who has rarely lost an argument. He addressed the room. He said the Keth Dominion welcomed the introduction of this new species to the galactic community. He said that the message transmitted 4 days ago had contained some inaccuracies which the Dominion would be glad to clarify. He said that the Keth's activities in the Vareth cluster were a matter of internal galactic security and that outside parties were encouraged to allow the Dominion to handle the matter through its established processes. Then he looked directly at Charlotte Rice and said that he hoped humanity would choose to begin its galactic relationships through dialogue rather than through what he characterized as inflammatory interference. Charlotte Rice waited until he had finished. Then she looked at him with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a conversation and is not in the least surprised by how it has started. She said, "We appreciate the Dominion's welcome. We would also like to share with you, and with all parties present, the authenticated recording of a communication sent by the Dominion's Supreme Coordinator to Sector Fleet Command on the 14th of November, 2378, in which the Coordinator explicitly states that the Vareth cluster represents the final systemic gap in the Dominion's mid-range expansion corridor and instructs Sector Fleet Command to resolve it before the next assembly review cycle." She placed a small device on the table. "We have the original transmission, the relay confirmations, and the internal response chain. The date and authentication codes are all consistent with Dominion communication protocols as we have recorded them over 180 years of monitoring." The Keth representative said nothing. "We have 73 more items of similar specificity," Charlotte Rice said. "We are prepared to share all of them with the Galactic Assembly upon formal request. We are also prepared to present them in whatever format the Assembly finds most useful for its review of the events in the Vareth cluster." I watched the Keth representative's face during this. I had read enough Keth internal communications to know their emotional indicators reasonably well. What I saw was not anger. It was the specific expression of someone calculating, very quickly, whether any of the responses available to them would make their situation better or worse. He excused himself from the meeting shortly thereafter. The Voreth representative, on his way out, stopped beside my chair and looked at me. I was not an official participant. I was a technical advisor on a temporary clearance, sitting slightly apart from the main table. He should not have known who I was. He said, "In Galactic Standard, you sent the message." It was not a question. I said, "Yes." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said something in his own language, not Galactic Standard, the native tongue of a species I had spent 11 years studying from a basement 3 levels underground. And I understood every word. He said, "Thank you for saying that it was wrong." I did not trust myself to respond in his language without my voice doing something I would find embarrassing in a professional context. So I just nodded. He left. The room emptied. Eleanor Ford appeared at my shoulder. She had been in the observation room for the past 4 hours and I had not known it. "The Keth representative is already transmitting to his command structure," she said. "Our monitoring station flagged it 30 seconds ago." "What is he telling them?" "That the situation is more complex than anticipated." She paused. "That is an understatement on a galactic scale." "Yes," I said. "The fleet in the Vareth cluster," she said. "They're withdrawing." I looked at her. "Confirmed," she said. "Began 30 minutes ago. Slow withdrawal, no announcement. They're going to try to frame it as a routine redeployment. Will anyone believe that?" She almost smiled. "With 73 items of authenticated documentation in circulation. No." I turned back to the empty table. The chairs where 6 galactic delegations had Saturday the plain walls. The functional furniture. The most ordinary-looking room in which something extraordinary had just taken place. "What happens now?" I said. Eleanor Ford was quiet for a moment. "Now," she said, "we stop watching and start talking." The Galactic Assembly's emergency session was called for a date that fell 3 weeks after the day I sent the message. It was the fastest such session had been convened in over 400 years of Assembly history, which I knew because I had read 400 years of Assembly records and could cite the previous record from memory if anyone had wanted me to. Nobody asked. Everyone was too busy. Earth's formal delegation consisted of 9 people. Charlotte Rice led it. I was the seventh member, listed on the official documentation as Senior Linguistic and Intelligence Specialist, which was the most accurate title anyone had managed to construct for what I actually did, which was no things. The assembly met in a location I will not describe in detail because some information still belongs to the Bureau's internal record, but I will say that it was not what I had imagined. I had spent 34 years building mental pictures of the galactic community from intercepted transmissions, and the gap between what I had imagined and what I actually saw when I arrived was the gap between a map and a place. The map is accurate. But the place is real in a way the map is not, and real things have a weight that accuracy alone cannot carry. We were the last delegation to enter the session chamber. That was deliberate. Charlotte Rice had spent 3 days negotiating our entry order, which sounds like a trivial thing until you understand that in the Galactic Assembly, as in most gatherings of powers that have existed long enough to develop elaborate customs, the order in which parties enter a room communicates an enormous amount about how those parties understand their own position. Entering last, in this context, was not a statement of lateness. It was a statement that we had been somewhere else first, doing things that mattered, and we had arrived when we were ready. Every delegation in the chamber turned when we walked in. I had read enough about the species present to know that for several of them, turning was not a simple physical act but a gesture with cultural significance, and I had to work very hard in that moment to remember that I was here as a diplomat's aide and not as a linguist who wanted to document everything for an archive report. The session chair opened the formal proceedings. The first item was the situation in the Varith cluster. Charlotte Rice presented the documentation. All 73 items. She did not summarize. She did not editorialize. She presented the material in chronological order, with full authentication headers, and let it speak entirely for itself. I watched the chamber as she spoke, reading the reactions the way I had spent my career reading transmissions, and what I saw was a room changing in real time. Not dramatically. There was no shouting, no sudden uproar. It was quieter than that and more significant. It was the specific kind of quiet that happens when a large group of beings simultaneously revises its understanding of something it thought it already knew. The Keth Dominion's official delegation interrupted 3 times during the presentation. Each time, Charlotte Rice paused, acknowledged the interruption, and produced a further piece of documentation that addressed precisely the point the Keth had raised. By the 3rd interruption, the Keth lead delegate stopped speaking mid-sentence and did not finish it. The Sivith Assembly representative called for a formal vote on the Varith situation at the end of the morning session. The vote on whether to formally censure the Keth Dominion and call for the immediate restoration of the Varith cluster's sovereign status passed with more support than any resolution of its kind in the Assembly's recent history. This was partly because of the documentation. It was partly because several civilizations that had long suspected the Keth of similar behavior in their own neighboring regions suddenly understood that a party existed which might have receipts on those situations as well, and that aligning with that party was, strategically, a considerably better position than defending the Keth. Politics, even across the stars, runs on recognizable currents. The afternoon session addressed humanity's formal status in the galactic community. This was the part one had thought about the most, over the weeks since the message. Status in the assembly was not a simple category. There were full members, associate members, observer designations, protected designations for younger civilizations, and several informal categories that existed in practice without any formal name. Where humanity landed in this structure would shape everything that followed, for a very long time. The Sivith representative proposed full membership. The Vorith representative seconded it. The Keth Dominion's delegation objected, citing what they called the unprecedented and destabilizing nature of humanity's introduction to the community. Charlotte Rice addressed the objection directly. "We understand the concern," she said. "A species that has been present and unannounced for 3 centuries is, by definition, an unusual circumstance. We would like to propose that our fitness for the responsibilities of full membership be evaluated not by the manner of our introduction but by the content of our character as demonstrated over those 3 centuries. We did not interfere. We did not manipulate. We did not use what we knew to gain advantages in trade or territory or political positioning. We observed, we documented, and when we finally chose to speak, we used what we knew to stop something that was wrong." She paused. "If the Assembly would like to argue that this represents a disqualifying pattern of behavior, we are prepared to discuss that. We would also invite the Assembly to consider what the past 3 centuries would have looked like if we had been announced and known, and had been subject to the same pressures and enticements and conflicts that have shaped the relationships in this room. There was a long silence. The Palendi delegate, who had been consistently one of the more thoughtful voices in every session I had observed her in over 11 years of monitoring, said something that I had not anticipated. "You are saying," she said, "that the silence was not cowardice. It was the only way to remain uncorrupted long enough to matter." Charlotte Rice considered that for a moment. "Yes," she said. "That is almost exactly what we are saying." The vote on full membership passed. After the session, I sat alone in a small room adjacent to the main chamber while the rest of the delegation handled the formalities. I had a glass of water and a tablet with 37 unread bureau reports, and I stared at the reports without reading them for a long time. Someone knocked at the door. I said, "Come in." It was the Vorith representative, the same young official who had spoken to me at the New Delhi meeting. He sat down across from me without being invited, which among the Vorith is a gesture of comfort rather than presumption, and I knew that because I had spent 11 years learning them. "The Assembly has formally requested the Varith cluster be granted protected status during reconstruction," he said. "I know. I was monitoring the side channel." He looked at me with the particular expression that I had come to associate with Vorith curiosity. "Do you always monitor everything simultaneously?" "Mostly, yes." "Is that not exhausting?" I thought about it. "It is," I said. "But it is also the only way I know how to be in a room." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into a case he had been carrying and produced a small sealed container, plain and simple, the kind the Varith used for personal documents. "Sovereign asked me to give you this," he said. "He could not be here. He is still on Veth Prime, helping with the restoration coordination. But he wanted you to have it." I took the container. It was light. I looked at it for a moment, then looked up. "What is it?" "He said you would know what to do with it when you read it," the Vorith representative stood. "I will leave you to it." He left. I sat alone in the small room with the sealed container in my hands. After a moment, I opened it. Inside was a single document. Handwritten, in the native script of the Varith capital, in ink that was slightly smudged at the corners the way documents become smudged when someone writes them quickly, with feeling, in a difficult moment. I did not need a translation system. I read it the way I had learned to read Varith, word by word and also whole, the way you read something when you understand not just the language but the person who wrote it. It was not long. It was not formal. It was the kind of thing a person writes when they want to say something true and do not have a great deal of time. Sovereign had written that he was told an unknown voice had heard his transmission. That he did not know who had heard it, or where they were, or why they had chosen that moment to step out of whatever silence they had been keeping. But that on the morning the Keth fleet had paused, and then turned, and then begun to move away, he had walked outside the council chamber for the first time in 4 days and stood in the light for a while. He had written that he did not have a word in his language for what he wanted to say. That the closest he could find was something that translated roughly as the feeling of being witnessed by someone who chose to look. He had written that he hoped whoever had chosen to look was well. That he hoped they knew it had mattered. He had written his name at the bottom, with a small mark beside it that I recognized from his public communications as a personal notation, the kind you add to something you mean to keep. I sat with the document for a while. The small room was quiet. Somewhere above me and across the stars, the Galactic Assembly was continuing its session, and Earth's delegates were doing the work of centuries in a single afternoon, and the history of our species was turning on an axis that had been quietly preparing to turn for 312 years. I thought about the basement in New Delhi. The plain gray ceiling. The cold coffee. The headset. 34 years of listening to a universe that did not know I was there. I thought about 47 words sent before dawn without authorization by a 51-year-old man who had finally run out of reasons to stay quiet. I thought about Sovereign standing in the light. I folded the document carefully and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I picked up my tablet, opened the Bureau's new diplomatic monitoring feed, the one that had been activated specifically to cover the Galactic Assembly session currently underway, and began to do the thing I had always done best. I began to listen. But this time, for the first time, there was a channel open that ran in both directions. And somewhere in the stream of incoming transmissions, among the 6 civilizations talking all at once about treaties and borders and history and the future, there were questions addressed directly to us. To humanity. By name. I answered the first one myself, in the original language of the sender, without consulting a reference file. After 34 years of practice, I knew them well enough. I had always known them. Now, at last, they were beginning to know us. And the silence that had kept us safe, that had kept us whole, that had allowed us to arrive at this moment with something worth offering, settled behind us like a door that had served its purpose and was now, gently and permanently, closed. We were here. We had always been here. And we were only just getting started.